2 hours ago, the Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement about the American strikes on Iran. 3 sentences, 47 words. No condemnation of the military action. No threat of consequences. No red line. No ultimatum. From the country that has spent the last 3 years positioning itself as the principal counterweight to American military power, the country that has armed Iran, trained Iranian officers, shared intelligence with Tehran, and built its entire global brand around being the nation that says no to Washington, 47 words and then silence. That silence is the most important geopolitical signal of this conflict, and almost nobody is reading it correctly. The instinct in most Western analysis is to read Russian silence as weakness. Moscow is bogged down in Ukraine, the logic goes. Russia cannot project power into the Middle East while simultaneously sustaining a land war in Europe. The silence is the sound of a nation that has overextended itself and can no longer back its partners. That reading is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete, because it misses the other thing that silence can mean in the grammar of great power competition. Sometimes silence is not the absence of a move. Sometimes silence is the move. To understand what Russia is actually doing, and why it matters more than any statement Moscow could have made, you need to understand the position Russia occupies in this conflict and how dramatically that position has shifted in the past 48 hours. First, Russia's relationship with Iran was never a symmetrical alliance. It was a transactional partnership built on overlapping interests that were always more fragile than either side publicly acknowledged. Russia sold Iran weapons, including the S-300 air defense systems, whose failure to intercept American munitions is now being studied in every defense ministry on the planet. Russia provided Iran with diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, vetoing resolutions that would have increased pressure on Tehran. Russia and Iran coordinated militarily in Syria, where their forces operated in proximity for years without a formal command structure that obligated either side to defend the other. What Russia and Iran never built, deliberately, carefully, by mutual unspoken agreement, was the kind of treaty relationship that creates automatic obligations. Moscow wanted the benefits of the Iranian partnership without the liability of being pulled into a conflict it did not choose on a timeline it did not control. That calculation looked shrewd for years. It looks like the defining strategic decision of this conflict right now. Second, the arithmetic of Russian military capacity at this moment in history is not favorable to intervention in a second theater. Russian ground forces are committed in Ukraine at a scale that has consumed equipment, ammunition, and experienced personnel at rates that Russian defense industrial capacity is only beginning to address. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has been degraded by Ukrainian strikes to a degree that has fundamentally altered Russia's naval posture in the region. Russian air defense assets have been redeployed eastward. The physical capacity to project meaningful military power into the Persian Gulf theater simultaneously with sustained operations in Ukraine does not exist in the Russian order of battle right now. This is not a secret. Every defense attaché in Moscow has been reporting this for 18 months. What is new is the moment at which that capacity gap has been exposed, and what it reveals about the architecture of deterrence that Russia has been projecting globally. Third, and this is the part that changes everything, Russia's silence is not being received the way Moscow intended it to be received. The calculation inside the Kremlin, according to 3 European intelligence assessments now circulating in Allied capitals, was that Russia could absorb the reputational cost of not defending Iran by framing its restraint as responsible statesmanship. Moscow would position itself as the adult in the room, the power that chose diplomacy over escalation, that prioritized stability over solidarity, that demonstrated the kind of strategic maturity that Washington, by contrast, had abandoned. That framing requires the world to interpret Russian silence as a choice. What is actually happening is that the world is interpreting Russian silence as a constraint. And the difference between those two interpretations is the difference between Russia emerging from this conflict with enhanced diplomatic prestige and Russia emerging from it with its deterrence credibility structurally damaged in ways that will take a decade to rebuild. But this is where the power balance begins to shift in ways that nobody in Moscow anticipated. The currency of Russian influence in the Middle East, in Africa, in South and Southeast Asia, everywhere that Moscow has spent the last decade building relationships, on the premise that it represents a credible alternative to American power, is not military capacity alone. It is the perception of military capacity. It is the belief, held by governments from Damascus to Caracas to Pyongyang, that aligning with Russia provides a security guarantee that Washington will factor into its calculations. That belief is now being tested against observable reality. And the test is not going well for Moscow. Every government that has built its security posture around Russian partnership is watching the Iran situation with the specific attention of a client evaluating its patron. The question they are asking is not abstract. It is operational. If the United States strikes a country with deep Russian military ties, Russian-supplied air defenses, Russian diplomatic protection, and Russian public commitments to regional stability, and Russia responds with 47 words. What exactly does Russian partnership provide? The governments asking that question are not asking it academically. They are asking it because their own strategic planning depends on the answer. What happened next inside those governments stunned analysts tracking the downstream effects of Russian silence. 3 African governments that have recently expelled French forces and invited Russian military advisors have quietly reopened communication channels with European counterparts that had been dormant for months. 2 Latin American governments that had been deepening economic ties with Moscow have paused specific elements of that deepening pending reassessment of what Russian partnership actually guarantees. A Central Asian government that had been resisting American pressure to limit Russian military access to its territory has begun responding with a receptiveness it had not previously shown. None of these governments have made public statements. None have formally changed their strategic alignments. But the direction of movement, visible in diplomatic traffic that Allied intelligence services are reading in real time, is consistent and unmistakable. Russian silence over Iran is producing a quiet but measurable reassessment of Russian strategic value in every region where Moscow has spent the last decade building influence as an alternative to the American-led order. Syria deserves specific attention because it is where Russian silence carries the most immediate operational consequence. Russia's entire Mediterranean naval strategy depends on access to Tartus, the only Russian naval base outside the former Soviet Union. That access is secured through the military presence that has propped up the Assad government since 2015. Iranian military infrastructure in Syria has been the co-guarantor of that stability. If the Iran strikes weaken Iranian capacity to sustain its Syrian presence, the Russian position in the Mediterranean becomes more exposed, not less. Moscow is watching a conflict in which its own core strategic interests are directly affected, and its response has been 47 words. The conversation about what Russian guarantees are actually worth is happening in Damascus right now, in terms that would have been unthinkable 12 months ago. The Kremlin understands this. Behind the 47 public words, Russian diplomatic activity has been intense, not toward Tehran, but toward managing the narrative about what Russian silence means. Russian state media frames the restraint as strategic wisdom. Russian officials conduct back-channel conversations with partners to explain that long-term commitments are unchanged. Russian military advisors in Syria have been instructed to maintain a visible operational presence that signals engagement without creating incidents that could escalate. Moscow is spending enormous diplomatic energy trying to control the interpretation of a silence it cannot break without capabilities it does not currently have. That gap, between what Russia is projecting and what Russia can deliver, is the central fact of the new power balance emerging from this conflict. The defense and energy sectors are beginning to price this shift. Defense firms tied to European rearmament programs are now modeling scenarios in which Russian strategic retreat from the Middle East accelerates demand for Western security partnerships across Africa, the Gulf, and Central Asia simultaneously, a generational reorientation of relationships that have been structured around the Russian alternative for 15 years. Energy traders are watching for a different reason. A Russia whose Middle East influence is diminished has less leverage over OPEC coordination and less capacity to use energy markets as a geopolitical instrument. That shift has compounding implications for American energy producers and the petrodollar architecture that Russian behavior has been quietly eroding for years. The American strategic community has begun to process this shift, but not yet at the speed the situation requires. The temptation in Washington is to read Russian weakness as a permanent condition, to conclude that the Ukraine war has resolved the question of Russian great power status and that the Middle East situation confirms it. That conclusion would be a strategic error of the same category as the Russian error of assuming Iranian partnership could be maintained without the obligation to defend it. Russian military capacity is degraded, not destroyed. Russian diplomatic influence is diminished, not eliminated. And a Russia that has absorbed the lesson of this moment, that deterrence credibility requires genuine military capacity, not just rhetorical positioning, is a Russia that will draw very different conclusions about what it needs to rebuild and how urgently. The power balance reversal emerging from this conflict is not a simple story of American strength and Russian weakness. It is a more complicated story about what happens to the entire architecture of deterrence when a defining moment reveals the gap between projected and actual capability. Russia built its post-Cold War influence on the projection of a return to great power status. The Iran conflict has exposed the distance between that projection and the underlying reality. The question that will define the next decade is not whether Russia recovers. It is what the world looks like in the years it takes to do so, and who fills the space that Russian credibility has vacated. That space is not being filled by Washington alone. China is moving into it with the deliberate patience of a power that has been watching its rival overcommit and waiting for exactly this moment. European governments paralyzed between American pressure and Russian energy dependence are finding the calculus has shifted in ways that create room for independent positioning. Regional powers that had been playing Moscow and Washington against each other are recalibrating toward the player whose commitments have proven more durable. 2 hours ago, Russia issued 47 words about a military strike on its most significant Middle East partner. 2 hours later, the global map of influence and alignment is shifting in ways that those 47 words cannot stop, and Russian diplomacy cannot reverse at the speed the situation demands. Washington wanted to degrade Iranian military capability. It may have simultaneously, without planning to, without even fully recognizing it, delivered the most significant blow to Russian strategic credibility since the end of the Cold War. Not through a single action directed at Moscow. Through a single action that revealed in real time on every screen in every foreign ministry on the planet the distance between what Russia promises and what Russia delivers. The most consequential weapon deployed in this conflict was not a bunker-buster munition. It was a 47-word statement. And the power it destroyed was not Iranian. It was Russian.